Phillip. So in this video, we're going to talk about George Orwell's creative nonfiction essay, Shooting an Elephant, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. So I really like George Orwell. He's one of my favorite writers. I like his style. I like the subject matter he tends to write about. I like his politics. And Shooting an Elephant is a political essay. There is in it a fairly graphic description of the death of an elephant after the speaker of the essay shoots it repeatedly. I'm not a fan of that. One of the things I've talked about repeatedly on this channel and probably will continue to talk about is that I don't like violence against animals. I don't like animal cruelty, any of that stuff. I'm not a fan of it. So I hate that paragraph. But the larger context of the essay, I actually really like, because this is an anti-colonial essay. So Orwell was British, but he was actually born in India, in Bengal, in a village called Motihari. He was educated in England, and he had a fairly elite education, even though his father was not necessarily like cultural elite. He was not like an aristocrat or something. He was a civil servant. And so Eric Blair, which was actually George Orwell's real name, George Orwell is his pen name, Eric Blair was born in India and had this fairly elite education back in the United Kingdom. But then in 1922, he became part of the imperial police in Myanmar. It was Burma at the time, British Burma at the time, now Myanmar. And he served in that capacity until 1927. During that time, Orwell became convinced that British imperialism was bad. It was a bad thing for everybody involved. And he became very much a supporter of decolonization. He was an opponent of empire, even though he had been a servant of empire. And Shooting an Elephant is, in a way, working through Orwell's ambivalent feelings about empire, these conflicting emotions that he has. And much of that is rooted in the speaker of the essay. And I'm going to say speaker of the essay, even though this is a creative nonfiction piece. And so theoretically, this is actually Orwell. We could refer to it as the speaker as Orwell, but I still think even with creative nonfiction, there should be that kind of distancing. We should be cautious about how much we read biographical experiences into the experiences of the speaker. So I'm going to continue referring to it as the speaker or some equivalent term. So the speaker starts out by establishing the anti-European sentiment, or perhaps more accurately, the anti-colonial sentiment of the native Burmese population. So the first paragraph says, in Mulmain, in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people, the only time in my life that I've been important enough for this to happen to me. I was subdivisional police officer of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit beetle juice over her dress. As a police officer, I was an obvious target and was baited whenever it seemed safe to do so. When a nimble Burman tripped me on the football field and the referee, another Burman, looked the other way, the crowd yelled with hideous laughter. This happened more than once. And it goes on a little bit. And so the first thing that we get is this, what seems like a kind of almost standard imperialist British opening. Oh, the natives are so sinister and tricky and deceitful and hateful and whatnot. But then Orwell immediately turns this essay, because we get to the second paragraph, which goes like this. All this was perplexing and upsetting, for at that time I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked up my job and got out of it, the better. Theoretically, and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters, the wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the gray-cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who had been flogged with bamboos. All these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. I did not even know that the British Empire is dying. Still less did I know that it is a great deal better than the younger empires that are going to supplant it. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. Incidentally, this essay is from 1936, so there is some casual racism, which would not have been unusual in 1936, but today is quite problematic. Though in fairness to Orwell, I think if he were writing in 2023, he would probably not use some of the dehumanizing language, the racializing language that he does use in this essay. But in 1936, this would not have sort of seemed out of place to anyone in a way it does today. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down, in secule secularum, upon the will of the prostrate peoples. And with another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. At the end of the first paragraph, he talks about how the Buddhist priests were the worst in terms of harassing him. Feelings like these are the normal byproduct of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you can catch him off duty. So again, Orwell clearly has this sense reflected by the speaker of this piece that British imperialism is a bad business for everybody. It is oppressive to the people of the colonies, in this case, the Burmese, but it's also bad for the colonizers. It's bad for the British. This moral decay, this being sort of forced by the circumstances of empire to utilize violence to dehumanize other human beings, etc., etc. In a way, this is kind of like... So the thing that this evokes for me, and I don't know whether or not Orwell would have read this, is Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. Because one of the things he says in that piece, he actually makes an anti-slavery argument despite the fact that Jefferson was a slave owner and continued to be a slave owner even after making this argument. But Jefferson made the argument in Notes on the State of Virginia that slavery was bad because it denigrated slave owners. This is, of course, an incredibly problematic argument. The idea that slavery was not bad because it was bad for the enslaved people, but bad because being a slave owner itself was a bad thing that eroded one's moral character, of course, is a ridiculously bad argument. And I think Orwell is getting some elements of that. But the big difference, I would say, is that whereas I don't remember Jefferson really making the argument that slavery was bad for enslaved peoples, Orwell clearly makes the case that imperialism is bad for the subjects of empire, in addition to being bad for the perpetrators of empire. And one of the things about Orwell that I really, really admire is he attempted as much as he possibly could to be honest about what he knew in the world. And because he had worked as an imperial policeman, he knew that perspective. He knew those experiences. And so in Shooting an Elephant, he's writing from that perspective that he knows, while also acknowledging the horrific things that he had to do in the service of empire. I say had to do. I'm a little hesitant with that phrasing. The things that he did in the service of empire. But the thing that really becomes interesting about Shooting an Elephant, for me, is actually in kind of the middle of the essay, because we have this bit. So the actual plot of the essay itself is that an elephant, just sort of everyday working elephant, in one of the villages for which the speaker is the police officer, has gone must, which is basically a sort of, according to the according to the Norton Anthology footnote, it is a state of sexual frenzy to which certain animals are subject at irregular intervals. So basically, this elephant has gone kind of nuts. It's broken its chains and it's sort of rampaging around, destroying people's vegetable stands in the market, causing general chaos. And then eventually it does trample someone to death. And we get a sort of hideous description of this dead body that's been sort of driven into the mud. And yeah, it's a fairly hideous graphic description of this dead body. And so the speaker sends over to a friend's house to get an elephant rifle in case he has to shoot the elephant. At which point, all of the villagers start sort of coming out, because once that rifle arrives, it becomes almost inevitable that the speaker will have to shoot the elephant. And this becomes the really interesting crux of it. As this crowd of Burmese people gather around him, he loses power. And so what he says here is, I'm going to read this fairly lengthy portion because I think it's really important. They did not like me. That's the indigenous Burmans. They did not like me, but with the magical rifle in my hands, I was momentarily worth watching. And suddenly I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. He's already gotten there and realized that the elephant is now pretty subdued. It's just eating some grass. It's probably fine. There's no good reason to shoot it. And suddenly I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. The people expected it of me, and I had got to do it. I could feel their 2,000 wills pressing me forward irresistibly. And it was at that moment, as I stood there with the rifle in my hands, that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. Here was I, the white man with his gun, standing in front of an unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece. But in reality, I was only an absurd puppet pushed to and fro by the will of those yellow faces behind. Again, casual racism, 1936. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life in trying to impress the natives, and so in every crisis he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask and his face grows to fit it. I had got to shoot the elephant. I had committed myself to doing it when I sent for the rifle. A sahib has got to act like a sahib. He has got to appear resolute, to know his own mind and do definite things. To come all that way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing? No, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me. And my whole life, every white man's life in the East, was one long struggle not to be laughed at. So what I think is that So what I think is really, really fascinating here is what Orwell is evoking is essentially Hegel's master-slave dialectic. So Wilhelm Georg Friedrich Hegel, the great German idealist philosopher, came up with this idea of the master-slave dialectic. He was big into dialectics. That's Hegel's thing. But the master-slave dialectic is basically this idea that so first off, when we conventionally think of a master and a slave, or a master and a servant, the master is the one with power, right? And this is, of course, true. But at the same time, what Hegel points out is that the master only exists as a master to the extent that the slave exists. The master's very being is conditional on the existence of the slave. And so in that sense, the slave makes the master at least as much as the master makes the slave. But there's actually more. There's another step, because the master only remains the master to the extent that the slave acknowledges the master as such. And so the master is actually subject to the will or the perception of the slave, in the sense that if the slave says, no, you have no authority over me, you are not my master, then that condition of masterhood, that being as a master, dissolves. And so the master has to act in such a way that the slave will always recognize and acknowledge that mastery. The master becomes subject to the slave to the extent that the master's existence as a master only works when the slave agrees. And so the master has to behave in specific ways. The master's freedom is constrained by the condition of being a master and requiring the slave's acknowledgement. And this is essentially what Orwell is working through here. This idea that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. Every white man's life in the East was one long struggle not to be laughed at. That need to maintain authority as an imperial official constrains the freedom of the imperial official. The official cannot act as they would want, in a private capacity. They cannot do what they would want to do. They have to do what is required of them in order to maintain that imperial authority. And so, not in the same way, but the same process occurs through different mechanisms. The imperial subject, the person who is imperialized, their freedom, their will is constrained, typically by violence. Whereas for the officer of empire, the person doing imperialism, their will is constrained by the need to obey certain structures that preserve the hierarchies of empire.